3 beds, empty. A clock stopped dead. A lighthouse, built to cut through the black Atlantic, stands silent on a rock at the edge of the world. On December 15th, 1900, 3 men were on duty at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. James Ducat, the principal keeper; Thomas Marshall, the assistant keeper; Donald MacArthur, an occasional keeper filling in for a sick colleague. They were not tourists. They were not reckless boys daring each other to climb a cliff in bad weather. They were professional lighthousemen, trained to live with isolation, machinery, and danger. They knew the sea. They knew how quickly a calm horizon could turn violent. And then, all 3 vanished. When the relief vessel finally reached Eileen Moor 11 days later, the men were gone. The lamps were prepared. The kitchen was clean. The beds had not been slept in. Outside, the Atlantic kept moving as if nothing had happened. 1 coat still hung inside the lighthouse. That detail has haunted this story for more than a century, because it means at least 1 man may have left the safety of the tower without dressing for the freezing December wind. So what pulled 3 experienced keepers out of a lighthouse and into the storm? Was it panic? Duty? A mistake made in the space of seconds? Or did the island itself, already surrounded by superstition, become the perfect place for a ghost story to grow? This is not just a story about how 3 men who disappeared. It is a story about how history becomes legend when the only witness left alive is the sea. Eileen Moor means Big Island. It is the largest of the Flannan Isles, a small cluster of rocks roughly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. On a map, it looks almost insignificant, a speck in the Atlantic. But for sailors, those specks mattered. They were hazards, landmarks, and sometimes the last thing a crew saw before disaster. Long before the lighthouse, Eileen Moor had a strange reputation. The island was associated with St. Flannan, and the ruins of an old chapel stood there long before the tower. In older traditions, visitors treated the place with caution. Stories gathered around it. Sailors knew it. Shepherds are said to have brought sheep there for grazing, but refused to stay overnight. That kind of detail matters because the Flannans were never just empty rocks. They were a place people already imagined as separate from the ordinary world, remote, sacred, dangerous, a place where men might work but never quite relax. In the late 19th century, the Northern Lighthouse Board decided to bring order to that darkness. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was designed by David Allen Stevenson, part of Scotland's famous Stevenson family of lighthouse engineers. Construction was hard, expensive, and physically brutal. Every barrel, rail, stone, and piece of machinery had to be landed from the sea and hauled up steep rock. The tower rose about 75 feet from a cliff roughly 200 feet above the water. Its purpose was simple: warn ships away from danger before the darkness took them. The light was first shown in December 1899. 1 year later, almost to the week, it would become one of the most famous empty rooms in maritime history. The men assigned to that rock were not ordinary laborers. Lighthouse keeping required discipline. The lamp had to be cleaned and prepared. The lens and machinery had to be maintained. Weather readings had to be logged. Supplies had to be managed. The building itself had to be kept in order because disorder at a lighthouse could become danger very quickly. James Ducat was the principal keeper. He had entered lighthouse service in the 1870s and worked his way up through years of duty before reaching the Flannans. He was experienced, trusted, and responsible for the station. Thomas Marshall, the assistant keeper, had a background as a seaman. He was younger than Ducat, but he was not new to hardship or rough water. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper. He was there because William Ross, the regular first assistant, was away sick. MacArthur is often described in later retellings as a tough, forceful man. But the fact that matters most is simpler. He was not supposed to be the permanent man on that watch. He was filling a gap. Together, the 3 men were responsible for keeping the light alive, and on the night of December 15th, 1900, the light went out. Around midnight on December 15th, a steamer named Arctur passed the Flannan Isles. Her captain expected to see the lighthouse flash through the darkness. Instead, he saw nothing. For a ship at sea, a missing light is not a small thing. It can mean fog, It can mean mechanical failure. It can mean men are in trouble. But in 1900, this was not a world of instant communication. There was no phone line from Island Moor, no radio call from the tower, no message that could cross the Atlantic wind in seconds. The Arctur reported the missing light when she reached port, but the warning did not trigger an immediate rescue. Days passed. The lighthouse remained dark. From Lewis, watchers could not see the light. Bad weather delayed relief, and the men on Island Moor remained beyond reach. The relief ship Hesperus finally arrived on December 26th, Boxing Day. Captain James Harvey was in command. As the ship approached, the first signs were wrong. There was no flag flying. There were no provision boxes ready for exchange. No keepers came down towards the landing. No figure appeared at the door. No one waved from the island. The ship sounded its horn, then its siren. A rocket was fired into the air. Nothing answered. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, was sent ashore. He knew these men. He knew the station. He knew what should have happened when Hesperus arrived. Someone should have been waiting. Someone should have been signaling. Someone should have been alive on that island. Moore climbed from the landing and made his way up the steep steps towards the lighthouse. Behind him, the sea broke against the rock. Ahead of him was the tower, silent and closed. The entrance gate was shut. The outside door was shut. Inside, the quiet was worse than disorder. The clock had stopped. No fire was lit. In the bedrooms, the beds were empty. In the kitchens, the pots and pans had been cleaned. The room was tidy. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken furniture. No blood. No message. No desperate mark scratched onto the wall. In the light room, the lamp was ready. The oil fountains and canteens had been filled. The lens and machinery had been cleaned. The work of the morning had been done. That is what makes the scene so unsettling. It did not look like chaos. It looked like interruption. The men had not vanished in the middle of some wild indoor panic. The lighthouse itself was in order. The keepers had completed their routine work. The evidence suggests that they disappeared later that afternoon, after the ordinary duties were finished and before the light could be lit for the night. The last written entries in the log were for December 13th, but the details for December 14th and the morning of December 15th had been written on a slate, waiting to be copied into the log. That was the normal practice. The famous final lines that people quote in the story were not there. Moore and the others searched the station. They searched the island itself. Still nothing. 3 men had been on Eileen Moore. Now the island held only their absence. For more than a century, this mystery has been retold as if the lighthouse itself was the scene of some supernatural event. You have probably heard the details. A meal left half-eaten on the table. A chair overturned as if someone sprang up in terror. Logbook entries describing impossible storms. Hardened men weeping. One keeper silent and strange. And a final line that reads, "God is over all." It is a perfect ghost story. It is also not what the records show. The overturned chair and the untouched mill entered the public imagination through poetry and later retellings, not through Joseph Moore's report of the scene. Wilfred Wilson Gibson's 1912 poem, Flannan Isles, transformed the disappearance into something more symbolic and uncanny. In the poem, the lighthouse becomes a stage, a door ajar, a mill untouched, a chair overturned. Those images were powerful enough to survive. People remember the poem's atmosphere, then mistook it for evidence. The alleged logbook entries are even shakier. The entries about terrible storms, crying keepers, and that dramatic final line do not appear in the official record. They appear to come from a later pulp-style retelling, published decades after the men disappeared. Once printed, they were repeated again and again until they felt ancient. But the real record is quieter, and in some ways more frightening. The real log does not show 3 men losing their minds. It shows routine work, weather details, a slate waiting to be copied, lamps prepared, machinery cleaned, a kitchen put back in order. There is no convincing evidence that a killer entered the lighthouse. No evidence that men fought. No evidence of madness, monsters, ghosts, or a final written prayer. The horror was not in the kitchen. It was not in the bedrooms. it was not in the logbooks. If the answer exists anywhere, it is outside the tower, down by the West Landing, where the Atlantic had left its own kind of testimony. Robert Muirhead, superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, arrived to investigate. He did not find a crime scene, he found weather damage. At the East Landing, things were mostly in order, but at the West Landing, the scene changed. The damage was extraordinary. A wooden box used to hold mooring ropes had been torn away. It had been secured in a crevice in the rocks about 110 feet above sea level. The ropes were found scattered among the rocks and tangled around the crane. Iron railings near the crane platform were displaced and twisted. A life buoy fastened to the railings had been torn away by the force of the water. A large block of stone, weighing more than 20 hundredweight, had been ripped from its place and carried down onto a concrete path. This was not the kind of damage caused by ordinary spray. Muirhead was looking at the evidence of sea force reaching heights that would have felt impossible. Then came the clothing evidence. Joseph Moore knew the keeper's working clothes. According to Muirhead's report, Ducat had been wearing sea boots and a waterproof. Marshall had been wearing sea boots and oilskins. Those were the clothes the men wore when they went down to the landings. MacArthur's coat, however, remained inside. That single fact keeps the mystery alive. Muirhead's conclusion was practical and grim. The men must have left the lighthouse to secure gear or inspect damage near the landing. While they were there, an unexpectedly large roller came in from the Atlantic. A wall of water rose against the rocks, burst through the railings, tore away equipment, and swept the men into the sea. The official answer is not supernatural. It is sudden water, bad timing, and 3 men standing too close to the edge of the world. But even the practical explanation leaves questions behind. Why were all 3 men outside? Lighthouse rules generally required 1 keeper to remain at the station. If Ducat and Marshall went down to secure the landing gear, why did MacArthur follow? Did he see something from the tower? Did he hear a shout? Did he step outside only for a moment, without his coat, because he thought there was still time to help? And if the danger was obvious, why were the doors closed behind them? Did one man close them calmly before leaving? Did habits take over even during an emergency? Or did the sequence unfold differently than anyone later imagined? The sea explains much of the evidence. It explains the missing men. It explains the twisted iron. It explains the torn life buoy and the missing rope box. It explains why no bodies were ever recovered. But it does not let us stand inside the final moment. We do not know whether the men were working carefully when the wave came. We do not know whether one man tried to save another. We do not know whether MacArthur ran out in alarm, thinking he could warn the others, only to meet the same water that had already taken them. There is a version of this story that is easy to tell. 3 men vanished, and the island was haunted. The harder version is more human. 3 trained men made a decision. Maybe it was routine. Maybe it was brave. Maybe it was a mistake so small it lasted only seconds. The Atlantic arrived with enough force to erase them. The Flannan Isles mystery survives because it sits in the gap between explanation and certainty. The official investigation gives us a likely answer. The men were probably swept into the sea by an immense wave while attending to storm damage at the West Landing. That answer fits the physical evidence. It fits the missing clothing. It fits the violence found on the rocks. But it does not answer everything. It does not tell us who stepped outside first. It does not tell us what MacArthur saw, or heard, or feared. It does not tell us whether the final act on Eileen Moore was duty, rescue, panic, or simple routine interrupted by impossible force. That is why the myths came so easily. An empty lighthouse invites imagination. A stopped clock begs to become an omen. A missing coat becomes a clue. A silent island becomes a stage for ghosts. But behind every legend are real people. James Ducat left behind a wife and children. Thomas Marshall left behind family on the mainland. Donald MacArthur left behind people who never got a body to bury and never got a final answer. The lighthouse continued to stand. The lamp was relit. Ships kept passing through the dark. Over time, the story changed shape. Poets added images. Magazines added false logbooks. Retellings turned duty into dread. but the oldest version is still the most haunting. 3 beds, empty. A clock, stopped dead. 1 coat left behind. And somewhere below the cliffs of Eileen Moor, the Atlantic keeping the rest to itself. Subscribe if you're the kind of person who can't leave a question unanswered. Turn off the lights. The path ahead is dark, and the woods are deep. Do not walk them alone. Subscribe to stay in the light, or click the video on your screen to wander deeper into the shaded divide. We will be waiting.